Thank you for having me to talk tonight. It's great to be back at the Bangerberg group and sharing tales of travels. I mean, it's in the number of years I've been away, of course, a few of those were dominated by COVID, and then we decided we'll test the waters and go for couple of little trips over to the east side of Europe, a region neither of us have been to before, and in particular looking out for some rare birds with fairly sort of northern affinities, and also some of the region's most elusive mammals. And that's going to be the feature of tonight's talk. All right. So, yes, the first trip we took was Estonia in February 2022, and that is the orange block on the map there, one of the Baltic states, with Russia to the east. And then we took a second trip in Finland in September 2023. The green block on the map there, much bigger country. And stretching much further north. So two different trips, two very different times a year. We took them for different reasons, which I will go into this evening. So the first one was Estonia, and I'd heard really good things about Estonia from friends who travelled there, particularly in sort of migration season. Because it's such a cold place in the winter, a lot of things just leave the country, and then come the spring, things head back. But we decided to go on a bit of a whim in the depths of winter and see a different side to Estonia. This was largely due to a tweet we saw from a guide out there called Tarvo. We'd met Tarvo at the bird fair in Rutland one year, and he was a very nice guy, and he was telling us about some of the great birds to be seen, and one of those was the hawk owl, which he featured in this tweet, but also some of the birds there and other wildlife too. And we, having not been anywhere for a couple of years, we're like, oh, just we'll just do it. We'll book it. Normally, we like to be quite sort of planned out and things, but this time we just did it on a whim, and a month or two later, we were on our way. So yes, it was still some. There were still some restrictions on traveling in terms of having to wear masks and things, but uh, that was the necessary price to pay to go away at that time, and yeah, most people behave themselves, so we got out there all right. Took a flight from our local airport, Stansted, and flew into Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. This was the scene that greeted us on our route into Tallinn, and well, it's a scene that might seem quite familiar to people in the UK right now with all the snow everyone's had, and but it took us by surprise because I think it'd been fairly mild at home, and then yes, we saw this really wintry scene. So we arrived and met up with a group. There was only a small group of us joining Tarvo on this tour. There's Sophie and myself on the left, and then the others in the group from largely the southeast of the UK, as it turned out. And but we were missing Tarvo initially because he'd gone and come down with COVID. So a friend of his stepped in called Sten. And this was the route we took. So it focused very much on northwest Estonia and the far west of Estonia, traveling first southwest and then over to Saaremaa Island, where we called in at a few different spots before heading back to the mainland, where we focused more on forest birds, and then yeah, before returning back to Tallinn. So it was only a short trip of about 5, 6 days. We tagged a day on at the end to have a look around the capital too. So getting out of Tallinn, we called in for some lunch, and we were really blown away actually how nice the food was there. I was thinking going to a former Soviet state, we might be on fairly basic rations for our time there, but actually the food was as good as you could expect anywhere in the UK, to be honest. So that was a very pleasant surprise. And then, yes, the other photo is us heading out west. They did a pretty good job of keeping the main roads clear, but there was a bit of a layer of ice, and I would have been quite nervous driving these roads, but Sten, our guide, was pretty confident, more confident than we'd like, actually. He was going a bit too fast at times, but we didn't crash, so I can't complain too much. Once you turn off the main road, it got quite icy indeed, but a lot of the cars are fitted with winter tyres and could actually handle the conditions all right. So yes, we had a ferry to catch to get over to Saaremaa Island. So we were on our way, but we got a bit distracted with a couple of birding stops on the way to get the trip off to a good start. And we quite quickly saw signs of black woodpecker. Being one of the largest woodpecker in Europe, they sort of ecologically they play an important role in creating dead wood and sort of leaving their impact on trees and snags. So we could see that black woodpecker was around. It took us a little while, but eventually we saw one. Their calls carried seemingly miles through the forest with the still, clear air. But great bird to start the trip off with. Also here we saw northern bullfinch, which is the same species as our bullfinch we get in the UK, but a different race and seemingly a bit bigger and chunkier and with more of sort of like a bit of a trumpety call. So the call is subtly different, and it was nice to see those. This male was pecking off buds on, I think, this birch tree. And before we left, just as it was starting to go dark, caught up with our first grey-headed woodpecker, fairly similar species to green woodpecker, but found further north. So this was one of the species we hoped to see on the trip, a bird you can't encounter in the UK. But we'd taken quite a bit of time over the birding here, and as we enjoyed the sunset, Sten suddenly realised, we're going to miss our ferry if we don't go now. So he put his foot down, we skidded around a fair few corners, and then we made it to the ferry port literally with minutes to spare before the boat left. And that was the last boat of the day, so it was lucky. But as we got to the port, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. It was absolutely freezing, as evidenced by the pancake ice in the harbour, which is, I think, usually formed from seawater when it gets a bit choppy and turns slushy and then sets, it forms these interesting shapes. So we headed over to Saaremaa Island and grabbed some dinner before our first night in Estonia. And we found out Sten, for his day job, when he's not helping Tarvo with bird tours, he's a professional pianist. And this was him playing a grand piano, sharing a few of Bach's preludes and fugues while we ate dinner. So that was a pretty unique experience I've not had on a birding tour before. And we got to our first guest house, which was well placed in the west of Saaremaa Island, ready for the next day when we headed down to Saaremaa Harbour. So we wanted to try and get one of the main birds of the trip under our belts as quickly as possible, because it can take some time to find them. Tarvo had told Sten that a few had been seen around the harbour, so we gave it a go. And not long after arriving, we located some stunning Steller's eiders. And this is a bird I wanted to see for quite a long time. I mean, all the eider family are spectacular birds, but this is perhaps one of the best. With those strange greenish tufts on the back of the heads. These are all males, and yeah, they'd be quite hard to resist if I was a female Steller's eider, I would say. But there were lots of males, perhaps less females in the port, and they were getting quite a bit of attention from the males. So we got some really nice sort of behavioural views and some quite close views as well. So here was the males that decided they'd want to display to the females. I mean, the breeding season must have been a fair few months away still, but they don't doesn't seem to stop them. The very dark chocolatey brown birds are the females, and they, as you can see, were largely asleep and paying no attention to the males. When they took flight, they sort of showed a different aspect of that lovely wing pattern, and yeah, we were just mesmerized, watched these birds for ages. And something I never knew about Steller's eiders was the tail pattern, particularly that bird on the right. It's got this really interesting sort of pointed tail feathers, and yeah, it's not wasn't present in all of them. So whether that was just a complete set of feathers or some stage of molt, I'm not sure. One of the members of our group, a chap called Gary Wright, was he's a keen artist and was not going to pass on the opportunity to do some field sketches. So this is him in the harbour area, just getting a few outlines and a bit of colour on paper, and his work was really nice, sort of uh, yeah, quite a unique style, I would say. And this was his finished painting of the Steller's eiders from our time in the harbour there. Also, there were some other birds. They didn't get so much of a look in, but normally we'd see a long-tailed duck, stunning sort of adult drake like this. This would be your bird of the day, but they were somewhat overshadowed. But still, after we'd had enough of the Steller's eiders, we looked at these for a while. And then nearby, we headed to Sea Watching Headland, which is sort of another site for Steller's eider, had we not been lucky in the harbour there. And as we were searching offshore, trying to get a bit of shelter from this conveniently placed wall, in amongst the swell, probably 100 meters out, were another 200 or 300 Steller's eiders. The views, of course, were not so good, but it was fascinating to watch them hunting, well, feeding, should I say. I mean, they would quite often just all disappear en masse. They seem to just do a very sort of uniform disappearing act. And then we'd scan and scan for a couple of minutes before the whole flock seemed to reappear. So it did seem to be a particular feeding strategy from the birds. Yes, so we pretty much all brought telescopes, expecting not all the birds on the trip to be showy, but yeah, they proved useful for a bit of sea watching. And as we left Sarema Island, despite it being absolutely freezing, we got our first taste of spring migration. So this was February in Estonia, similar latitude to more northerly parts of the UK, and the first migrant cranes were coming back. We also had the first lapwing of the spring and a few other birds. So there were signs that spring was pushing its way in, but it didn't feel like it. Back on the mainland, we got what ended up perhaps been the surprise of the trip when Sten pulled the car to an immediate halt. He'd seen some eye shine by the road. We reversed, and luckily the eye shine was still there, maybe about 20 meters from the road. So we got spotlights on it, and it turned out to be a Eurasian lynx, which none of us had dared to expect, but we were very lucky to see. The views were brief and it was a bit obscured, but there was no mistaking it given the size. And then it sort of lolloped away into the forest, and that was that. The sort of enigma disappeared back into the forest. But we went up to where it had been sat and walked around, and the size of the paw prints were quite impressive, really. I didn't think they were that big. It was probably a fairly large male, I would have thought. Um, so yeah, been quite the day. Steller's Iders in the morning and Eurasian lynx in the evening. And this was just an illustration of what we saw, but perhaps not so well. And Tavo does run towards a little bit later in, well, between sort of winter and spring to look for lynx. Estonia is a really good country to see lynx, wild lynx in. But they normally have to focus on lynx and put in multiple days searching, dawn till dusk and after dark as well in order to see them. And then it's still not guaranteed. So we were very lucky. So we moved lodgings to another nice guest house with really friendly Estonian hosts, and they made us feel very welcome and constantly providing us with good food and drink. But the next day we woke up and it was snowing heavily. Any thoughts of spring arriving were put on hold, and the snow put quite a dampener on the birding for the day. So we just enjoyed the wintry landscapes. I mean, walked around, visited a few spots, but didn't see too much this day. But that's the risk of going at that time of year, I suppose. Later that day, we got Tavo back, said goodbye to Sten. He'd been great. And Tavo got right into the thick of it in terms of trying to find us some good birds. It's worth saying that birding these forested areas by yourself in winter is quite a challenge. So it was really good to have Tavo's local knowledge. He's lived in Estonia all his life, and he knows this particular region of the country like the back of his hand. So he led us to some prime areas for some of our target birds. Whilst it was snowing and we weren't seeing our target birds, we did see some willow tits, which were nice. They are declining even in Estonia, perhaps due to forestry management practices not being ideal for them. But who knows? I think there might be other reasons as well. But yeah, different race to the ones we see in the UK. So these were nice to catch up with, but the calls were quite similar. And also nuthatch, the same species as ours, but a very different looking bird with these frosty white underparts, setting it apart from our race in the UK. So I was pleased to catch up with this one. A bit later in the day, it got sort of close to dark. We went looking for owls. They start their breeding seasons quite early in the year. So even with all this snow around, Tavo was hopeful that we'd get some sightings as birds became a bit more active. He runs a number of nest box projects, and we visited this one, which was a nest box that has had oral owl in, but we didn't see on this occasion. So we just kept visiting different likely spots. We did hear pygmy owl, but none of them sort of showed themselves really. They stayed hidden, but it was nice to hear them all the same. And thankfully, the next morning it had cleared. We've got the layer of snow still, but it was the most perfect still morning. And we come to the Marimetsa forest, one of Tarvo's favourite spots. And we had a good morning for woodpeckers. With it being perfectly still, we could hear woodpeckers from what seemed like miles away. And that included Eurasian three-toed woodpecker, which would have been great to see, but it called in the distance and never came any closer. And the nature of the forest meant we couldn't really go towards it. So we weren't lucky with that one, but it was still good to hear it. And we did catch up with lesser spotted woodpecker, great spotted, and more views of grey-headed. But here we got a couple more of our target birds for the trip. First being nutcracker, which, despite annual sort of claims in the UK, there's never been one in the UK really since I've been birding. So had to go abroad to see one, and it was well worth it. This was right at the top of a tree, but showed beautifully against the blue sky. And after a lot of trying, we got views of hazel grouse. Pardon me. This isn't my photo. It didn't sit on a branch long enough for me to get a shot, but here's a similar photo to the view we got. And yeah, for quite a large bird, it's got the most peculiar little high-pitched call and really quiet as well. So you have to really listen out for these. And even if you hear one call, you're not guaranteed to see it, even though it's probably only a matter of meters away. They can hide themselves away in the conifers very easily and were surprisingly arboreal in my experience. Another species which we get in the UK, but of a different subspecies. So this is the northern subspecies of long-tailed tits with that beautiful snowball of a head. The rest of the bird looks pretty much the same, but yeah, we had flocks of these move through the forest, and they were a delight to watch. So you may remember at the start of the talk, I mentioned Tarvo had said that we had a chance to see hawk owls. In fact, it had been the best winter for hawk owl for probably a handful of years in Estonia. There were a fair few wintering birds about. So we spent a lot of the next day with the improved weather on the search, visiting this wind farm and open fields where one or two birds had been wintering. We did spend a lot of time, but didn't see one, unfortunately. So that's one I'm going to have to look for again one day. We did, however, see other birds while we were there. So there was a couple of great grey shrikes perched on top of trees and even hay bales in fields. But typical for great grey shrike, they don't let you get all that close, and they just disappear without trace. And yeah, even here they can be tricky birds to catch up with. And a magnificent white-tailed eagle. I think this was a young bird with that unmistakable barn door silhouette and splayed wingtips. We got a few during the trip, and each time that would sort of get the attentions of the local corvids and gulls when we were by the coast. And a mammal. Apart from the lynx, we hadn't really seen any of the mammals until this point. So it was nice to see a roe deer, quite a bit paler than the animals I'm used to seeing in the UK. So perhaps a local adaptation. And we were starting to get close to the end of the trip, and we still hadn't seen an oral owl. And Tarvo was like, "Oh, this is the bird you've got the best chance of seeing in the remainder of your time." And during the trip, we'd been in the little minibus and rotated round, and so everyone got a chance to spend time in the front with Tarvo and with good views as we drove along. And this had been my first chance to actually sit in the front and kind of really search for birds as we drove along. And one of the moments of the trip was when Tarvo turned to me and said, "It's Ural o'clock. It's the right time of day to see Ural owl." And I kid you not, 5 seconds later, I turned right, scanned the trees to our right, and there, sat right by the road, was this magnificent Ural owl. And that definitely went down as one of the birds of the trip because just the circumstances of it being the last gasp, last chance to see it, and it just was there, sat in a clearing with a beautiful background and showing off its frosty tones as well. So yeah, that was very popular with everyone, and we all stayed in the van so it wasn't spooked by us, and it did sit there for a few minutes to allow us nice chances of photographs. So yeah, as we started to head back to Tallinn, we had one last morning of birding with Tarvo, and so we called in at one of his sites for white-backed woodpecker and waited a few minutes, and then a white-backed woodpecker appeared. So that was really good local gen from Tarvo, and he proved his worth. And yeah, it wasn't. This is not the best view, but that's partly because around this time I dropped my camera and that packed up. So I switched over to just taking some phone scoped shots at this point. So yeah, still nice to get a record shot. Um, don't really see the main feature here, the white back, but you can see the sort of um, diffuse kind of pinkish tones in the vent area, and yeah, so subtly different to great spotted woodpecker. So we said goodbye to everyone on the tour. They've been a great group. I'm still in touch with quite a few of them, and we share stories about travels and reminisce about our Estonian trip. But me and Sophie decided to extend the tour a little bit, just have a day or two around Tallinn, just by ourselves, and take in the old city and yeah, on the shores of the Baltic, and it was still pretty darn cold. And yeah, so there's some marvelous architecture, and here's an old sort of a Russian Orthodox church from the time when Estonia was part of the Soviet Union, somewhat against their will. And but there's even in the city there were some interesting birds to see. So this is a herring gull, but one with yellow legs. And I'd heard about this form of herring gull known as a missus. There's been claims in the UK. I've never seen one in the UK, but yeah, so quite a few of the herring gulls here did indeed have yellow legs. Rather confusingly, when a bit further south, you've got the yellow-legged gull. So got to be careful with your gulls. And here was a pair of them. They showed well, but I think that's because I had some chips which they were interested in. And yeah, so this trip coincided pretty much with the start of the war in Ukraine. And as we were walking around the city, we just coincidentally happened to be walking past the Russian consulate. And as you can see, a lot of the signs, the Estonians were making their voices heard, given their particular history with Russia and the Soviet Union. I think a lot of people in the country were concerned, and particularly people we spoke to, the guest house owners, yeah, were very concerned. So, I mean, when you're traveling around on a birding trip, you can often be in a bit of a bubble. So it was quite a stark reminder that not all's well in this part of the world. So yeah, that was quite sobering. But yeah, we stayed in a lovely hotel, and despite its sort of Soviet past, Estonia is now a modern country with lovely accommodations and food, and I'd highly recommend it. It's got that wonderful mix of new and old, and fantastic wildlife. and I think we will be returning one day to witness Estonia at a different time of year. Tarvo had told us to keep an eye out for goshawks, which can be found around Tallinn. A couple of times we saw flocks of pigeons go up, but didn't see a goshawk, but I suspect there was one in there somewhere. And just before we departed, we called in at a forest on the edge of the capital, Stroomy Forest. Bit of a park for Estonians to go and enjoy at the weekends. But we called in because this was a known site for one woodpecker we hadn't seen yet, the middle spotted woodpecker. And although this is not my photo because my camera was out of action by this point, we did get pretty good views, fairly similar to this photo, and yeah, that was nice. And in the park, we did see some goshawk action, including a nest, which was the first time I'd found goshawk nest as well. So yeah, I imagine on another visit, goshawks might feature more heavily. So that was the end of part one of this talk, our short Estonian trip. We didn't see too many birds, overall 68 species, but the ones we did see were very memorable. And of course, we saw the Eurasian lynx as well. And that was the icing on the cake. So, the second part of my talk is about Finland, not too far away, to the north, and another trip that was planned at very short notice, on a bit of a whim, and not particularly at a sort of prime time of year for birding. So we decided to go here because Sophie had some work on near Helsinki, doing some surveys, and if she didn't invite me along, I was going to stow away in her hold luggage or something because there's no way I was going to miss out on this opportunity. So well, I joined up with her after her surveys. We hired a car. We decided to do this one ourselves and just went exploring. But this time of year, September, not perhaps such a good time of year for birding in Finland, or not as famous anyway, as the spring and early summer period when most birders go. But it is a good time of year in the country to see mammals. And so this trip had a bit more of a mammal focus. And one mammal in particular I'd wanted to see in Finland for a long time. I remember discussing with friends about trip reports where people had seen some of Europe's most elusive mammals, thanks to the construction of hides and dedicated locals who'd spent a lot of time trying to encourage some of these mammals to become a bit more regular. So that was to be the focus of this trip. So we flew into Helsinki at the bottom of the image there, the bottom of the map, and headed north to Lahti and Kotalad and Murki, excuse my pronunciations, before heading up towards the Russian border at the far right of the map there, near Lieksa. And some of the mammals we were after show well in that region, probably because of the border region with Russia and the sort of lack of humanity in a way, or sort of the lack of presence of people, should I say? And so there's not too much hunting pressure, and animals are free to move across the border between the two countries. So we spent most of the trip up there before heading back down, following the Russian border fairly closely, and then back to Helsinki. So we got in our car and drove north and decided to break the journey up towards Lieksa by staying a night in a cabin, getting the full Finnish experience, a log cabin in the woods. And it happened to be sited by a beautiful lake. So we woke up the next morning and there were calls of crossbills and siskins as they migrated over, but also calls of black-throated diver, which I've not heard before, and Whooper swans. It's a huge lake, but the calls just drifted across the water, and it was a very atmospheric experience. So this was one of the black-throated divers, still in summer plumage, with the beautiful reflections of the trees behind lit up in the sun. We saw a black-throated diver was the most numerous diver we saw actually on the lakes, and which was nice because it's the first time I'd seen them in breeding plumage. So after a morning there, we drove up towards the Russian border, and the traffic became less and less, up to a point where we didn't really see any cars for the last hour of the drive. And we stopped in Joensuu, a town not too far away, where we discovered Friends and Burgers, and quite a departure from the food we had in Estonia. We ended up having fast food, but I have to say, I mean, from Sophie's point of view, it was gluten free, so good for her. And from my point of view, it tasted about 20 times better than a McDonald's. So I recommend it. And they're all over Finland. So that's a handy place to start. But as we got towards Lieksa, we honed in on our location, which was Eero place. Eero is a local biologist who studies some of the mammals in this region. And as we approached, I could see a couple of trail cameras positioned on trees, and I suspect, well, he was receiving images remotely to his mobile phone, so he knew we were about to arrive. The place was a former hunter's lodge, so beautifully decorated lodge, but now it makes the base for Era's sort of ecotourism venture, and he plows, I think, most of the money he gets back into the study of the animals and their conservation. And as you go in, you can see the signs of it being a hunter's lodge. Here was a taxidermied capercaillie, just adorning the wall as you do, and also a little nod to one of the animals we were here to see. And I'll go on to talk about that shortly. So we got a really nice introduction from a lady who was there and met Error as well. And he doesn't speak too much English, so the lady there gave a really nice introduction to the project they're running here and our best options for trying to see some of the animals. So there's a range of hides. We decided to go down to the wetland first to focus on a few particular mammals. And one of the hides is perched up on the hill here overlooking the wetland. And this is the view down to the wetland. So it's quite a luxurious hide, really. Those are very comfortable chairs. And it also includes accommodation because you go in the hide, and some people spend days on end here to get the views they want. And we were going to be here at two different sets of hides over the next few nights. We decided not to go in this particular hide because although it's a nice view, we wanted to get down at ground level and get a little bit closer to the animals if possible. So here was me, lumbered up with my sleeping bag and overnight gear, ready to go into the hides by the wetland. And this was the hide we went in. So they've got beds and toilets, so you don't need to leave the hide. And we were well looked after. They gave us a cool box with food and drinks as well, so got everything we need. So there's Sophie as we're about to go in the hide, and you can see there's pouches built into it, so you can poke your camera out of. The little glass strips to the side, so you can get a sneak view of the animals that might be out in front of you. One nice feature here was you see in the bottom left of the image was a sort of ground level window to really get you down to the same level as the animals. Always a good tactic for photography in particular, which I was quite keen to attempt. And yeah, so the inside of the hide's surprisingly comfortable. The only thing was, though, just being basically a wooden shed, they weren't particularly insulated, so we knew we were in for a fairly cold night, so we brought a lot of layers. Oh, I'll just go back because also you get provided with warm woolly slippers, and that was a nice touch, I thought. So this is the view from the hide, and this is the ground level one. So you're pretty much just lying on your front with your camera poking out, and um, yeah. But before we even arrived, um, we got views of the first mammal and the one I wanted to see most on this trip, which was wolverine. Um, yeah, so I couldn't believe it. We got there and they were already bounding around the margins. They were nervous, but they were waiting. And Era does put out bait. He hides it under rocks and up on trees and things. So this helps bring the animals in, but also they have to work for it. They're fully wild animals that have just become slightly accustomed to people. And so, yes, for the next few hours, we just watched probably a handful of different wolverines around the wetland come and go, earning their alternative name in many other languages as the glutton. I think in Hungarian they're known as the gluttonous badger, and yeah, so I mean, distantly related to badgers, but this is the largest terrestrial mustelid on Earth. Um, I think badger can come close in terms of weight when they're fattened up in the autumn, but these were really large animals. I was really surprised, and uh, with patience, one plucked up confidence and came right up to the hide, and I couldn't believe it. This one pretty much making eye contact with me. So yeah, as I mentioned, some of the food was put up tree trunks, and I was surprised that the wolverines were so adept at climbing, but they have to be able to find food wherever they could get it. In the wild, they uh, can't guarantee coming across food too often, so it's fairly low density environment in terms of prey, and so they stash food and they have a big appetite, which earns them the name of glutton. So yeah, across the wetland, it was nice to see the wolverines coming out of presumed den sites. That cluster of rocks on the left, one came out of, and yeah, just a nice sort of landscape view of Wolverine there. But with the passage of time, they put on a great show and perched, well, climbed up into some interesting locations, and I think this was one of my favorite photos of them, with it licking its lips after just having had a big lump of meat, and yeah, just stood there taking it all in. And then across the back of the wetland, this image kind of gives you an idea of how they sort of galloped, sort of front paw to back paw, and sort of lumbered along with their tail cocked. But you can also see the thickness of the coat. And apparently, the coat is particularly sort of good at keeping water off them, which has caused them to be vulnerable to poachers and hunters in much of their range, which spans from, well, right around the whole Arctic. So Canada, Alaska, and then in Europe and Asia through Finland over towards Russia and the Far East. Yes, their pelts have been collected, and that has caused declines to the degree that they are classified as vulnerable, so they're threatened with extinction. But the population in Finland, thankfully, is doing quite well. They're at about 150 animals. Um, so numbers are stable, but they are able to move across to the Russian side of the border at will. It wasn't all about mammals, though. We enjoyed a few surprise bird sightings. This was a Eurasian goshawk, a juvenile bird that swooped in right past the hide and perched up on one of the tree trunks. And for a moment, given the size, I thought, oh, it's a buzzard flying in. But then it perched and I could see it was an accipiter. Um, yeah, beautiful goshawk. And by far the best views I've ever had. And as the sun set and day turned to night, we brought out our thermal imager, was which came in real use here. Because I mean, normally we'd have probably just gone to sleep and not realised what was going on out there. But a steady procession of activity and animals coming and going was witnessed. So yes, Sophie found this wolf in the thermal, and thankfully it's got a recording function, so we could take some images of it. We never actually saw this particular animal with our own eyes because it was pitch black and we weren't using spotlights. So, but it was kind of spooky knowing these. Well, this wolf was out there, and even though we couldn't see it, and just before we were about to go to sleep, it was pretty late by this point. Sophie did one last scan with the thermal and found this brown bear, which was crossing that same um, tree trunk that the wolverine pictured earlier was. But given this was such a huge animal, it spans quite a lot of the tree trunk itself. So this just came down to the water's edge. And I was quite surprised to see a reflection actually off the water in the thermal. But makes for quite a nice image. Unfortunately, Eero told us this had been one of a family of three young brown bears, and two had recently been hunted. And it seems the status is that the hunters themselves get to set the limits of what they're allowed to shoot, and so they are a bit over generous to themselves. They're perhaps not a good way to police it and ensure that animals continue. So Era's work here to show to study them and monitor the numbers is very important work. Another bird which took advantage of some of the food hidden around the area was Eurasian jay. They were stashing food in preparation for the winter ahead. And this one showed beautifully on that same log that a wolverine had been perched on earlier. So that was our time in the wetland hide, and we left our sightings in the diary and for other people to see, and we'd enjoyed reading about other people's previous visits, and yeah, been an excellent day. So with a few hours before we went into the next high, we had a little look around the local area and improved on our views of black woodpecker from our Estonia trip. This one showed quite nicely in an area of wet woodland. And by the lodge, Era had put out a few piles of bird seed here and there, and we got views of crested tit down to a meter at times. So they seemed fairly fearless. It was great to study them up close. More willow tits were coming in. These were quite numerous here, actually. More numerous than the other tit species. And another mammal for the trip, red squirrel. Again, very good views. One thing that struck me in Finland was how much fungi there was. This is a classic fly agaric mushroom. But quite often, if we were walking through a woodland, there'd just be mushrooms everywhere. and I didn't even start to try identifying most of them. There were just too many and not enough time. So, but it was just nice to take it all in. They put out a great spread for us, so we filled up before going into the next hide. Oh, and also you can do the classic Finnish routine of having a sauna session and then jumping into an ice cold stream. So we did the sauna bit and dipped a toe in the stream and decided, nah, that bit wasn't for us. So having done a few Finnish necessities, we went into the forest hides. These offer views of slightly more terrestrial mammals, ones that weren't hanging around the wetland, but it can vary over time. Sometimes this can be the best place to see wolverine, other times it can be the best place to see other ones. Similar to the last hide where you've got pouches you can poke your camera out of, and the windows allow you just to see what's in front of you. But it wasn't long before our first wolf appeared. Nice to see it with our actual eyes this time. This was one of three young wolves, not quite full grown, that came in. Again, some bait had been tucked away under rocks and things in front of the hide, and they were very nervous. I suspect they could smell us. But with time, their confidence grew and gave some great views in the late afternoon sun. All three animals had different plumages, different coats, should I say, different patterns and colours going on. This was a lovely mix of sort of steely grey and buffy tones on this animal. And one of the other animals was much more beige. So this is two of the youngsters, the beige animal being on the left. And then eventually we got close views of this one. It's perhaps the least, well, it's the most nervous and the least showy of the three, but it did come quite close at one point. So we'd been spoilt with the wolves there, and even after dark, we used the thermal and saw what looked like an adult wolf come in, slightly bigger. But again, here the wolves are very nervous, very shy because there is a history of hunting in the area. And it was nice that these wolves have somewhere where on this particular land where they are safe. So we put our sightings into the diary. We'd had a good mix of birds. Goshawk had whizzed by a couple of times, didn't perch up this time. And the ever-present jays and willow tits and things were around as well. So that after a couple of nights in hides and a few days in the area, up in Lieksa, we did a little bit of birding. The forest here was more mature than other places we'd been, and we hoped there was a chance to perhaps to see Siberian tit or Siberian jay. But at this time of year, they're much quieter and less showy, so we didn't succeed in seeing those. But it was nice to visit their habitats at least, with a view to returning one day. So near the end of the trip, we'd got a tip off from one of Sophie's colleagues who'd also been out doing surveys of a great site near Helsinki, where we could look for elk, and otherwise known as moose in North America. And we came to this large clearing where were quite a number of white-tailed deer. But we waited and waited, and it was starting to go pretty dark when before we actually saw any activity. Nearby, we did actually get some migrants, which was a pleasant surprise. So this was a blue throat, and this was perched on some sunflowers as it was heading south on its journey. Wasn't expecting to see migrants, so that was nice. but then we also got some migrating geese and also quite a large number of migrating cranes as well. So with winter approaching, a lot of birds were leaving the area. And then this image doesn't show quite how dark it had got, actually. I think it's compensated somewhat, but yeah, just before dark, this pair of elk came out of the forest, um, much, much bigger than the white-tailed deer that had been around, absolutely huge. Here's a closer view of the mother on the left and its calf on the right, showing that classic stretched out face and big ears. And so that was a great way to wrap up our time in Finland. So we'd seen 77 species of birds here and 7 species of mammal. But again, as with Estonia, it was very much about quality over quantity. And I'd highly recommend Finland as an easy place to go birding yourself. Were you wanting to track down all the best birds, perhaps some of the tricky owls and woodpeckers, I'd definitely recommend a guide. I've known people go out there looking for owls and woodpeckers themselves and not see too much. So that local knowledge is key. But if you ever happen to be thinking of an autumn trip, it's a great time of year for the mammals out there, and there's some great opportunities to see them up close. And that is the end of my talk. So thank you for listening, and hope you've enjoyed it. And if you've got any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure there's going to be loads of questions. That was a wonderful, lots to talk about and admire. And thank you for delivering it so ably there. So I'd like to hand it over to anybody either to personally ask their questions or via the chat box, whichever you prefer.
We have one in the chat already. Susanna's asking, could you say how to book accommodation in the bird hides in Finland?
Okay, sure, yeah. So I think Eero has got a website. I think you can book direct. We went via Fin Nature, a well-known tour operator out there. They come to the bird fair pretty much every year. And so we did chat to them there one year and got some really useful information from them. So yes, I'd either go direct to Eero or Fin Nature. The good thing about Fin Nature is they have contacts with other local operators, so they can advise on perhaps the best places to go at certain times. They've got their ear to the ground in terms of which place has got, say, wolverines showing at any time or brown bears. I think there's better places to see brown bear than where we went in other parts of Finland. So we're particularly focusing on wolverine on this trip, but I'd recommend this place to see wolverine in particular.
Okay. And Polly's asking or stating we'd really appreciate. Oh, okay, I was going to ask a question, but it says you've answered it. But she was saying appreciate a local guide rather than going on an organised trip. But as you kind of just mentioned that.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, Fin Nature contacted Era and made all the arrangements for us, so we just turned up. Some people don't like spending the night in the hide, and you don't have to. They have really nice accommodation on site as well, so in warm lodges and things. So yeah, you've got plenty of options if you go up that way.
Thanks, Henry. It sounds really well organised. It's good to see. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one if possible.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, great talk, Hannah's, and some good photos there as well. Brilliant. Loved it.
Thanks.
When you went to Estonia, where you had the Steller's Ida in the winter, do the numbers fluctuate from year to year? Are they declining or are they pretty stable at the moment?
I think there's been a bit of a decline over the long term. Whether that's a true decline in the numbers of birds in total, or just they're not coming that far south, perhaps because the sea is less frozen further north than it used to be with climate change. It perhaps is the case that less birds are just having to winter that far south and not having to make the journey. But as I mentioned, there's still a good number offshore of 200 to 300 birds. But how many of those come into the harbour, I think, is more based on weather at the time. You know how choppy the sea is or how cold it is. That might force birds into the harbour, where it's a lot calmer.
Cheers, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. With things like the wolverine, Henry, have they got big home ranges? Because when you said 150 animals, I was quite surprised it was that small a number. But will they cover a very large area?
Yeah, I think normally they can have huge territories. So I think I've read something like up to 600 square kilometers
Oh, crikey.
for a territory, absolutely huge.
Yeah.
Here they've become a bit more regular thanks
Mm.
to the provision of food, and they're taking advantage of that. They're making the most of it. It was never the case that there were so many animals around it felt artificial, but I think it has allowed them to be a bit more static in this particular area, which I'm personally grateful for, because it'd be almost impossible to track down a wolverine otherwise. So yeah, but I know out in the States, wolverines sort of end up following wolf herds around a little bit more, and sort of chancing, trying to nick some food off the wolves, or if the wolves have left any part of a carcass, they'll take advantage of that and clear it up as carrion. With wolves being less of a presence in parts of Europe, I don't think they behave in quite the same way. But yeah, so it's interesting.
And is there much other bird watching scene in Finland and Estonia? Is there much in the way of information transfer and all that?
So I think, I mean, both countries have got birders, not anywhere near the same density of birders as in the UK. I mean, their populations are much smaller to begin with. I think Estonia only has a population of 1 million people, and Finland has a population of 5 million. So there's not too many people there anyway. But some of them are birders. And yes, I know Tarvo in Estonia is very well connected with the other birders in the country. And he organizes and participates in bird races in the spring, and does educational events to try and recruit the next generation of birders, really. So he in particular is doing great work in Estonia, and yeah, I'm not so sure on the status in Finland, but yeah, I mean, it's got some great birds, so I'd imagine there's plenty of people who are at least appreciative of that, even if they're not full-on birders.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions for Henry?
We've not got any questions, but we've got a thank you from Susanna and Polly as well, saying that was lovely. The owl who posed for you was fabulous. I think that was the Earl owl, wasn't it?
Yeah, it certainly was. You deserve that. It was a fantastic way to end that day, wasn't it? Absolutely superb.
Yeah.
Well, the whole talk was, Henry, on both counts, Estonia and Finland, and it was such a lovely, gentle pace that you set, giving us plenty of time to appreciate everything you were showing us and telling us. It was a lovely commentary, really complimented the countries involved and the images that you showed. And as Steve said, there were some cracking images. Well done on your photographic skill, and that portrait of a goshawk, for example, it was just stunning, and several of the elusive mammals. Such a treat and a privilege to see those so well. In fact, the whole mammal side of it was probably for most of us, certainly me, a lovely surprise. Something that we don't often enjoy so much with bird group talks, but really fitted in so well this evening. And certainly if you were visiting those countries, it's got to be a must-see thing to do. And it was just fascinating to see the wolverine, particularly. And so glad you had the luck with the lynx. I mean, that was pretty special, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. But I guess in many ways, the images that stick most in my mind are the Stellers right at the beginning, because there can surely be no more stunning European bird than those males. And to see them on, I think it was your first day in the harbour, was just an amazing way to set the scene, what was to become two very, very memorable trips. You know, it's just great to hear firsthand about such countries. Really extends one's horizons and ambitions. Great to hear it from somebody like yourself that's got such a wide interest and knowledge. Really brought the best out. And it's really pleasing to see that there are experts based in these countries that one can take advantage of, who are making their living doing it. And it's a win-win situation. But certainly that local knowledge is really crucial, isn't it, for getting the most out of such countries. It's good to see, too, that the value of the bird fair in promoting these countries and introducing people, the punters, to the experts. I think that's one of the great benefits of the bird fair. I know it has its numerous critics, but I think on the whole, it does a huge amount for better understanding of global biodiversity than even David Attenborough can achieve with his films. But thank you ever so much for putting that all together. I know that your partner Sophie had a big hand in it too. She was your constant companion on the trips themselves, and I know that you both share a love of imaging the wildlife and putting together talks like this. And I thank you both for that. And thank you personally for all your time and effort this evening. It's so good to see you again, Henry. Know that you're doing a great job of work over in East Anglia. Good luck with everything over this coming winter and spring. Really personally hope to get to see you in that part of the world before not too long. And of course, if you end up coming back to North Wales, let us know, and we'll try and lay on some good rarities for you on your return to North Wales. But thanks ever so much on behalf of all the bird group, and look forward to maybe hearing again from you at some point about more of your travels. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.